There is an unspoken contract we make with the walls of our homes. We believe that when we lock the front door, turn off the lights, and lie down in the dark, the space around us is entirely our own. We trust the architecture. We trust that the drywall, the floorboards, and the narrow crawl spaces are nothing more than the hollow bones of a building, holding up the roof and keeping the outside world at bay. But a house is merely a physical structure, and spaces left empty rarely remain empty for long. When a home becomes a vessel for grief, it can unknowingly invite something else inside, something that breathes, watches, and waits in the narrow gaps between the plaster. In the late autumn of 1986, the town of Pepperell, Massachusetts was the kind of quiet, working-class community where neighbors knew each other by name, and violent crime was something that only happened on the evening news. The Bowen family lived in a modest house in one of these quiet neighborhoods. Frank Bowen, a hard-working father, lived there with his two daughters, 16-year-old Tina and 8-year-old Kari. The house, however, was not a happy one. The family was drowning in the fresh, suffocating wake of a profound loss. Frank's wife, the girl's mother, had recently passed away after a brutal battle with cancer. Her death had left a heavy, oppressive silence in the home, the kind of silence where every creak of the floorboards and every gust of wind against the window panes seemed magnified. The girls, particularly young Kari, were struggling to process the permanence of their mother's absence. It was within this fragile, shattered ecosystem that the anomalies began. At first, the intrusions were so subtle they were easily dismissed as the byproducts of grief and an aging house. A door left slightly ajar that someone swore they had closed, a television channel changing when no one was holding the remote, small items, a hairbrush, a piece of jewelry, a half-eaten sandwich, vanishing from countertops and dressers only to reappear days later in places they didn't belong. Frank Bowen, consumed by the demands of his job and the pressures of single fatherhood, rationalized these events. He told his daughters they were simply being forgetful, that their minds were playing tricks on them because they were under immense emotional strain. But for Tina and Kari, the atmosphere inside the house was shifting. The air felt heavier. They began to experience the distinct primal sensation of being watched. As the weeks bled into November, the subtle anomalies escalated into undeniable physical disturbances. The girls began to hear rhythmic tapping coming from behind the walls of their bedroom. It wasn't the erratic scrambling of mice or the settling of old timber. It was deliberate, a slow, methodical knocking that seemed to track their movements across the room. On several occasions, the toilet in the bathroom would flush on its own while the girls were alone in the house. The fear took root, but it was a specific, complicated kind of fear. Because they were surrounded by the recent death of their mother, the girls' minds naturally gravitated toward the supernatural. They began to wonder if the spirit of their mother was trapped in the house, trying to communicate with them from beyond the grave, or worse, if the grief had attracted something malevolent, a poltergeist feeding on their sorrow. Their desperate need for answers led 16-year-old Tina to confide in a neighborhood boy she barely knew. His name was Daniel LaPlante. He was also 16, a socially awkward and troubled teenager who lived nearby. Daniel had a reputation for being strange, often spinning elaborate, disturbing stories, but he presented himself to Tina as someone who understood the occult. He claimed he had a sensitivity to the spirit world and offered to help the girls contact whatever was haunting their home. Vulnerable and terrified, Tina agreed. Daniel came over to the Bowen house one evening when Frank was away. He gathered the two girls in the dimly lit living room and initiated a makeshift séance. He asked the spirits to make their presence known. Almost immediately, the house responded. Heavy knocks echoed from inside the walls. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Daniel spoke to the unseen entity, and the entity answered with thuds that reverberated through the floorboard. To Tina and Kari, this was absolute, terrifying proof that their house was haunted. They clung to Daniel, viewing him as a protector, a medium who could navigate this nightmare. They had no way of knowing that the séance was a grotesque piece of theater. Daniel was not communicating with a ghost. He was communicating with the empty spaces of the house, spaces he had already mapped, explored, and claimed as his own. The psychological torment reached its breaking point a few days later. The girls came home from school to find their house violently violated. Furniture had been overturned, the television was smashed, and most chilling of all, there was writing on the basement walls. Smeared in what looked like blood but was later determined to be ketchup, were jagged, erratic messages. The messages were taunting, threatening, and deeply personal. One of them simply read, "I am in your room." The girls fled the house in absolute hysterics. When Frank Bowen returned and saw the vandalism, the illusion of a haunting evaporated. Ghosts do not smash televisions, and they do not write on walls with condiments. Frank realized, with a sickening drop in his stomach, that there was a flesh and blood intruder in his home. He immediately called the police. Officers from the Pepperell Police Department arrived and conducted a thorough sweep of the property. They checked the basement, the closets, under the beds, and the perimeter of the house. They found nothing. The doors and windows were locked from the inside. There were no signs of forced entry. The officers suggested it might be a prank by local kids, took a report, and left. But Frank Bowen could not shake the feeling of dread. He sent his daughters to stay with family friends, refusing to let them sleep in the house until he understood what was happening. The next day, Frank was at home, moving through the quiet, empty rooms. He walked into one of the bedrooms and stopped. The door to a built-in closet was slightly open. He knew he had closed it. He approached the closet slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs. As he pulled the door open, he noticed something strange about the back wall of the closet. It wasn't solid. A section of the paneling had been carefully pushed ajar, revealing a dark, narrow crawl space that ran behind the drywall, connecting the bedrooms and the bathroom. Frank peered into the darkness, and the darkness moved. Stepping out from the shadows of the crawl space was a figure straight out of a nightmare. It was Daniel LaPlante, but he did not look like the awkward neighborhood teenager who had conducted the séance. He was shirtless. His face and torso were smeared with dark, tribal-style war paint, and in his hand he gripped a heavy, sharp hatchet. He raised the weapon, his eyes locked onto Frank, dead and unblinking. Frank, operating on pure adrenaline, backed out of the room, slammed the door, and ran for the nearest telephone to call the police. When the officers returned, they drew their weapons and breached the house. They moved cautiously into the bedroom, opened the closet, and ordered the intruder to surrender. After a tense standoff, Daniel LaPlante emerged from the wall, dropping the hatchet. He was arrested and dragged out of the house in handcuffs. It was only after Daniel was removed that the police truly examined the crawl space. What they found was a horrifying testament to obsession and predatory patience. Deep inside the walls, nestled between the insulation and the wooden studs, they found a makeshift living area. There was a sleeping bag. There were empty food wrappers, discarded juice boxes, and jars filled with human waste. Daniel LaPlante had not just been breaking into the Bowen house. He had been living inside it. For months, he had existed in the suffocating darkness, just inches from where the girls slept. He had listened to their conversations. He had watched them undress through small, meticulously drilled peepholes. When the house was empty, or when the family was asleep, he would slide out of the wall to eat their food, use their bathroom, and move their belongings just to watch them unravel. He had orchestrated the entire haunting, using his intimate knowledge of the home's secret arteries to move silently from room to room. He had manipulated their grief, played the role of the savior, and retreated back into the walls to revel in their terror. The revelation sent a shockwave through the community. The idea that a teenage boy could seamlessly integrate himself into the hidden architecture of a family home, living like a parasite while inflicting severe psychological torture, was beyond comprehension. Daniel LaPlante was charged with breaking and entering, armed assault, and a litany of other offenses. He was placed in a juvenile detention facility, undergoing psychiatric evaluation. The Bowen family, traumatized beyond repair, moved out of the house. They could never again look at a wall without wondering what's breathing on the other side. For a brief period, it seemed the nightmare was over. The monster had been pulled from the walls and locked away. But the justice system, particularly concerning juvenile offenders in the 1980s, was often a revolving door. Daniel was evaluated, processed, and eventually released on bail into the custody of his mother, pending trial. He was sent back out into the world, back into the quiet, wooded neighborhoods of Massachusetts. The authorities viewed him as a disturbed burglar, a bizarre voyeur. They severely underestimated the depth of the darkness that had been incubating inside him. By December of 1987, the story of the boy in the walls had become a dark local legend, but Daniel LaPlante had moved on from psychological torment. The voyeuristic thrill of watching people fear him was no longer enough. The desire for control had mutated into a desire for absolute destruction. Just a few towns over from Pepperell, in Townsend, Massachusetts, lived the Gustafson family. Andrew Gustafson was a prominent local attorney. His wife, Priscilla, was a beloved 33-year-old nursery, and she was heavily pregnant with their third child. They had two young children, 7-year-old Abigail and 5-year-old William. They lived in a beautiful, sprawling home, surrounded by dense woods. They had no connection to the Bowen family. They had no connection to Daniel LaPlante. They were simply living their lives, completely unaware that a predator was roaming the tree line at the edge of their property. On the afternoon of December 1st, 1987, Andrew Gustafson returned home from work. The winter air was biting, and the sun was already beginning to set, casting long, gray shadows over the snow-dusted yard. As Andrew walked up to his house, he noticed something felt off. The house was entirely silent. Usually at this time of day, the home was chaotic and full of life, with the children playing and Priscilla preparing dinner. Andrew unlocked the door and stepped inside. He called out to his wife. There was no answer. He moved through the quiet house, the sense of dread mounting with every step. He walked into the master bedroom. What he found there would forever shatter his reality. Lying on the bed was his wife, Priscilla. She had been brutally beaten and shot twice at point-blank range. She was dead. Andrew, plunging into a state of sheer, uncomprehending shock, stumbled out of the room, screaming for his children. He ran upstairs to their bedrooms, praying they were hiding, praying they had somehow escaped whatever monster had invaded their home. He found Abigail and William in the bathtub. They had not been shot. They had been forced into the bathtubs, fully clothed and drowned. The Townsend police arrived at a scene of unimaginable horror. The sheer brutality of the crime, the methodical extermination of a pregnant mother and her two young children left seasoned investigators physically ill. The house was locked down as a massive crime scene. As detectives began processing the evidence, they looked for forced entry, for a motive, for any sign of who could have committed such an atrocity. They found a chilling clue. The perpetrator had not just broken in and killed the family. He had taken his time. He had lingered. There was evidence that he had eaten food from the refrigerator after the murders. As the police broadened their search, a disturbing piece of intelligence came across the wire. A local youth, currently out on bail for a highly publicized and bizarre home invasion in a neighboring town, lived in the vicinity. Daniel LaPlante. The connection was immediate, and the manhunt that followed was one of the most intense in Massachusetts history. The town of Townsend and the surrounding communities went into total lockdown. Schools were closed. Residents locked their doors, armed themselves, and stared out their windows at the encroaching tree line. Hundreds of police officers, armed with rifles and accompanied by canine units, descended on the dense, freezing woods surrounding the Gustafson property. Helicopters beat the air overhead, scanning the winter landscape for any sign of movement. For 2 agonizing days, Daniel LaPlante vanished like a ghost. The cold was brutal, dropping well below freezing at night, leading police to believe he had to be seeking shelter somewhere. They combed through abandoned barns, sheds, and empty houses. Finally, a tip led investigators to a local recycling center. Officers converged on the area, weapons drawn, checking every crevice and container. Deep inside a large metal dumpster, buried beneath piles of trash and freezing debris, they found him. Daniel LaPlante was pulled from the garbage, shivering, filthy, and entirely devoid of emotion. As he was handcuffed and placed into the back of a police cruiser, he did not ask why he was being arrested. He did not claim innocence. He simply stared forward with a blank, hollow expression. The subsequent investigation and trial revealed the terrifying randomness of the Gustafson murders. Daniel had not targeted them for any specific reason. He had simply been wandering the woods looking for a house to break into. He found the Gustafson home, slipped inside, and waited. When Priscilla came home, he attacked her. When the children came home from school shortly after, he systematically ended their lives to eliminate witnesses, or perhaps simply because they were there. During the trial, defense attorneys attempted to paint Daniel as a profoundly disturbed youth, a victim of severe childhood abuse and neglect, suffering from mental illness that warped his understanding of reality. But the prosecution dismantled this narrative with chilling efficiency. They demonstrated that Daniel LaPlante was not a chaotic, disorganized schizophrenic. He was a cunning, patient, and highly organized predator. The way he had constructed the hidden living space in the Bowen house, the way he had manipulated the girls, the way he had executed the Gustafson family and attempted to cover his tracks, all of it pointed to a calculating psychopath who knew exactly what he was doing. He didn't kill because he was confused. He killed because he wanted to. The jury agreed. Daniel LaPlante was convicted on 3 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms in a maximum security prison. He was removed from society permanently, locked in a cage of concrete and steel, where there were no hidden walls to crawl behind and no innocent families to observe in the dark. But the incarceration of Daniel LaPlante did little to erase the permanent psychological scars left on the communities of Pepperell and Townsend. The physical crimes had been solved, the perpetrator punished, but the conceptual damage remained. The Bowen house and the Gustafson home stood as grim monuments to a terrifying reality. We lock our doors to keep the monsters out, assuming the threat always comes from the outside. But the true horror of Daniel LaPlante was not just the violence he inflicted. It was the way he violated the very concept of sanctuary. He proved that the boundaries we build to protect ourselves are an illusion. He showed that the space behind the drywall, the dark gap above the ceiling, the narrow void beneath the floorboards, these are not just structural necessities. They are blind spots in our own homes. And when the house settles at night, and you hear that faint, unexplainable knock from inside the wall, logic tells you it is just the pipes cooling down or the wood expanding. But for those who remember the boy in the walls, logic offers no comfort, because they know, with absolute certainty, that sometimes the dark spaces are not empty, and sometimes the thing you are most afraid of is already inside the house with you.